Good afternoon, everyone. I am Yolanda López, Acting Director of the Voice of America, and I am so delighted to be here with you today. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome our distinguished panel of journalists who will discuss an issue we should all care deeply about: the role of the free press amid the intensifying attacks on global media. We are witnessing increased threats to journalists, and each day there are more and more challenges to the free flow of information worldwide. We are seeing autocratic governments and new methods to intimidate the news media into silence. In those countries where there is no press freedom, where authoritarian regimes deprive their citizens of access to fact based reporting and accurate news and information, our work is more critical than ever. Today, I look forward to hearing more from our distinguished guests about their personal accounts as working journalists, as well as the work that is underway to safeguard those carrying out the critical work of our profession. I'd like to introduce VOS Press Freedom editor Jessica Jerreat. Jessica leads VOS award-winning press freedom coverage, which takes an in-depth look at the challenges and risks to media globally. Before joining the newsroom in March 2020, Jessica worked for the Committee to Protect Journalists, where she edited reports on global censorship and attacks on the press, and the Times of London. VOA's dedicated press freedom coverage has won awards, including from the Association of the International Broadcasting, and Jessica was part of VOA reporting team presented with the National Press Club's Arthur Rose Press Criticism Award for coverage of events taking place in VOA's own newsroom. Jessica?
Hi, Yolanda. Thank you very much for that introduction. So I'd just like to welcome our audience today and thank them for being with us. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon here on the East Coast. We have an amazing lineup of panelists today who bring great sort of expertise into some of the key areas where we're seeing threats and attacks on journalists. I would like to introduce you all to those today. First, we have Clayton Weimers, who is the Deputy Director of Reporters Without Borders Washington, D.C. Bureau, where he oversees the Media Watchdog's North American advocacy. So thank you very much for being with us today, Clayton.
Thank you, Jessica.
We also have Cindy Regidor, who's a Nicaraguan journalist, and she has experience in print, television, digital journalism. Cindy had to leave Nicaragua, but she now works for the news outlet Confidencial, as well as the Spanish language France 24 from Costa Rica. Welcome. It's great to have you here with us today. And finally, Danila Galperovich, who is our VOA Russian service correspondent. He's worked in Russia for VOA, the BBC, Radio Liberty. Danila has covered the First and Second Wars in Chechnya, Russian politics and current affairs, and is also a regular contributor to VOA's own dedicated press freedom coverage. It's a busy time in Russia, so really thank you very much for being with us today, Danila.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we are speaking to you all today from a virtual events platform, and this event is playing back on YouTube. Our audience is joining us live, and there'll be a replay available. And we really encourage as many people in the audience ask questions. We really want to hear from you about your views on and any questions you may have for our panelists today about the situations in their countries or just globally, the issues facing journalists. So let's get started. As Yolanda said, this panel marks not only VOA's 80th anniversary, but it's also the lead up to World Press Freedom Day on May 3rd. And as we approach that date, it seems like the world's press is just under ever more threat from restrictive laws, censorship, attacks, and deadly violence. Russia has dominated the headlines since February with its invasion in Ukraine, but Moscow's been waging the second war against the independent media, which goes back way longer than just the events taking place in Ukraine more recently. As Russian propaganda and disinformation rises, so too have efforts by Moscow to censor independent voices. So with that situation in mind, I'd like to turn the floor over first to Danila. Danila, in the past few weeks, we've seen Russia pass a new law on false news to try to block reporting about the military and the events in Ukraine. The media regulator there has issued fines, and we've seen some of the most iconic independent media outlets being blocked or forced to stop work. But are these tactics from Putin and his administration new against the press?
No. Vladimir Putin began to persecute journalists from the very beginning of his rule in 2000. And I just remind you that one of the first such journalists was an employee of the media from the family of USAGM, at that time BBG, recently deceased Andrei Babitsky. At that time, he was a correspondent of our farewell Russian service who worked in the Second War in Chechnya. And almost immediately after Putin's attempt to silence Babitsky, Putin initiated the takeover of the most advanced and independent television in Russia, the NTV television company. And to be journalists in Russia, it was always difficult and dangerous. We all remember the murder of Anna Politkovskaya and Paul Khlebnikov and many others. And Kremlin from that time likes to make the most servile, like most propaganda instruments from those media that in the past were the most famous in terms of independence and criticism on the authorities. To speak about the same NTV channel, now it's one of the nastiest propaganda tools of Russia. So through his years, Putin financially strangled the media, and at the moment of aggravation of his confrontation with the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, Kremlin switched to outright bans. And I also remind that first media, which Russian authorities recognized as foreign agent in 2017, were media sponsored by US government. It's the Voice of America, us, RFRL, and Current Time. And then Kremlin started to pronounce and label individual journalists as a foreign agents. So these tactics, they were gradually, rising all the time of this 21 year of Putin's rule. And of course, now everything changed in general after open war started, that canceled the last standards from the Russian government, which is still somehow adhered to some standards before the start of the war. So, but again, already during the reprisal against Alexei Navalny in 2020, and I remind you that Navalny's activities were in many ways similar to journalist ones. So during the adoption amendments to Russian constitution, which directly prohibited discussions on certain topics, it was clear that the state in Russia was completely ready to tighten the nuts in the information space. And that's what we see now. It's just a continuation of long established tactics, just to some radical side.
And what do you think that Putin is, or Russia is trying to achieve by closing down the media environment? Doesn't it sort of raise alarm among Russians that they're seeing these independent news outlets close off? What is he really trying to achieve with sort of, I guess, just closing down the media environment and upping the disinformation, both in Russia and sort of Ukraine and other places where they have interests?
I would divide this question in two questions, which I actually, Jessica, were to your questions. What he wants and how public reacts. So on what he wants, I rather will agree with the opinion recently expressed. The friend of mine, editor-in-chief of Dozhd TV channel closed in Russia, Tikhon Zyatko, he said that the leadership of the Russian Federation, on one hand, doesn't want voices against the war to be heard inside the country. And on the other hand, the Kremlin tried to prevent public to hear the information in Russian Federation that differs from what's been broadcast by leadership. And I would only add to this opinion of Tikhon Zyatko that the Russian leadership doesn't want any independent voice to distract anyone in Russia from this huge propaganda campaign that it has unleashed since the beginning of this year, even before the war. It is important for leadership, for Kremlin, that the flow of propaganda should be dense and uniform without interference. And Putin is trying to exclude independent sources of information, and he's ramping up propaganda to an incredible extent. And how public react. Unfortunately, in Russia, there was not a great appetite for independent media all the way. I remember relatively small rallies and demonstrations in support of NTV channel when Kremlin took over it. And probably it's because we can say it from social polls that active war in Ukraine been supported by Levada Center, which is the independent poll center in Russia, by 2/3 of Russian people, and just over a quarter actually condemned the invasion in Ukraine. And the mood in society is complex. You know, about half of people like proud of the way the army operates and so on. So in Russia, unfortunately, this protests against the suppression of press freedom, they were minimal throughout Putin's rule. And there was a case when Medusa journalist Ivan Golunov was accused in having drugs, and actually police in Russia planted drugs to Ivan Golunov, and there were protests all over Russia because everybody immediately associated themselves with this guy who'd been planted narcotics and planted drugs and said, you did something wrong. But that was probably just one case when public was more or less, express solidarity with the journalists.
It's really interesting, and just the way that sort of disinformation campaign can sort of start to take root. I was particularly interested in you mentioned Russia's use of the foreign agent law over the past 18 months. This is under this law, if journalists are considered to have funding from foreign governments or links to foreign governments, they have to label themselves as being a foreign agent. And it's kind of used as a dual tactic. It both burdens media outlets and it sows suspicion among audiences about whether this information is coming from. Unfortunately, we're not just seeing this in Russia. Nicaragua enacted similar legislation with a foreign funding law, which is similarly affecting the media environment there. Cindy, I'd like to turn this over to you and just ask for a little bit of information from you about how the foreign funding law and Nicaragua's own harassment of the media environment has impacted the ability of journalists like you to be able to cover what's happening in government, particularly in an election year.
Hi, thank you, Jessica, for your question. Well, like Danila said, this is a tactic, part of a strategy. The law for the regulation of foreign agents is one of at least 3 bills passed in Nicaragua to criminalize and suffocate social movements, civil society organizations, and independent media. The creation of this legal framework that also included a cyber crimes law and a sovereignty law was an attempt of the regime to legalize the crackdown the authorities have exercised for over 4 years now. Since the massive protest in 2018 that demanded President Ortega to step down, the independent media outlets that reported on the human rights abuses were a main target, and we started seeing all sorts of attacks, including censorship, the illegal occupation of our offices, physical attacks, journalists who have been jailed. There are still 6 members of the media landscape in jail under psychological torture, while dozens have fled the country due to the political persecution. So this law, Jessica, it's part of a plan, like I said, designed by the government to silence all kinds of dissent, all spaces of information outside of their control, like Danila said, that happens in Russia. And the law sought to prevent most independent media outlets from working legally inside the country. And it was also part of the narrative of the regime, which justified the crackdown on the media and civil society by discrediting us and falsely claiming that we were part of an attempted coup funded and planned by imperialism and foreign agencies. This is like the narrative, the official narrative of the government. So as you can all imagine, it is a very hostile environment to work in, where the state authorities consider journalists one of their enemies, where there's no rule of law and all of the branches of the government have been co-opted by the ruling party, including the judicial branch, which means that practicing journalism entails many risks, including incarceration. So the reporters that remain in the country, they have to be very careful and decide whether they do not report about political matters at all, or if they do, a big part of them are now withholding their bylines as a security measure. But there are always ways to defeat censorship, and I think that the citizen reporters have been key for us to keep reporting with them. You know, in 2018, we had this brutal crackdown, and the citizens, they provided us with a lot of evidence, and obviously we were double checking and verifying, but this was key for us to keep reporting and what was happening in places where we couldn't be. And this also happened in the election in 2021 in November, which, by the way, was considered a sham by the international community because President Ortega put in jail all the presidential hopefuls. What we did is we gathered a group of citizens who were willing to work with us, to report with us, to have guidelines that they could use to observe, to go to different polling stations and see what's happening. And we produced our content together. We obviously verified and double checked everything. And we also were using other sources who had bigger and wider networks throughout all the country, so that we could see and we could have pictures and videos of what happened during that day, because we didn't have any access at all, like any access to the polling stations, and the police officers and the pro-government citizens. They can also harass journalists if they see them like reporting in the field. So it's difficult, but we're trying to manage. We're trying to find ways to not let censorship stop us from doing our job.
It's really interesting, particularly this idea of working with citizen journalists. Particularly, I know a large portion of the Nicaraguan journalists, it feels like, have had to go into exile for a range of reasons. And like you say, those staying hide their bylines. In that hostile environment, though, is it how has that sort of impacted the way that you work with sources, and how sort of audiences or just people on the street sort of react if they see media out reporting?
Oh yeah, no, it's very, very difficult. It's a very critical situation. It has definitely impacted in the way we interact with our sources, especially after last year when we saw how the government imprisoned several of our sources, not only the presidential hopefuls that I mentioned previously, but they also incarcerated civic leaders, journalists, businessmen, human rights defenders, pundits, former diplomats. And we also saw how many of them were being accused of treason. And part of the alleged evidence was interviews they had given to different media outlets. So you can imagine, of course, how our sources are afraid of talking to the press. And so if you read Nicaraguan independent media, you'll notice how now it's more common than ever to find pieces with unnamed sources, as people feel that it's the only way that they can share their opinions, information, their knowledge. And yeah, we also rely on the few ones that are still in Nicaragua, and they bravely decide to speak publicly and on the record. And we also talk to sources who are abroad in exile, as they can talk in behalf of the ones who can't because they're inside of the country. I think it's important to mention that regardless of not being able to have sources on the record in some of our pieces, we remain credible, and our audiences trust that we do high quality, reliable journalism that is exposing the truth and the fact that the government doesn't want them to find out. And I think that they understand, they're very understanding of the fact that many of the sources can't risk their lives and their security.
It's fascinating. It's just such a difficult but interesting time to sort of be a journalist in Nicaragua, and to these solutions that you guys are coming up with is really amazing. I find it particularly interesting the way that laws around protecting national security, or like journalism, is often sort of used as an excuse to, we've got to protect from national security, or this is a reason that we can censor, obstruct reporting. Is these sort of excuses that governments use, or reasons that they cite for arrests or these laws. Clayton, I was particularly interested with Reporters Without Borders. You have this like great global perspective, and we obviously see similarities between Russia and Nicaragua, but I wonder, where else are you seeing where governments are claiming that they're just protecting national security or national interests as an excuse to censor and block reporting?
Sure, and unfortunately, the conflict between national security and journalism occurs all over the globe. It's not restricted to one region of the world, and it's not even restricted to one type of government. You see it quite often in conflict zones. In Ethiopia, for example, the government routinely goes after journalists who are covering the war in Tigray. You see it in governments that are strongly controlled by the military, like in Myanmar or in Egypt. In Egypt, merely covering an opposition political group is often enough to be labeled a terrorist and to come under government harassment there. That said, we shouldn't just think of this as a problem that happens over there from a Western perspective or just in autocratic regimes. Even democracies are very susceptible to overzealous application of national security rules to be used against journalists. In the UK, the Official Secrets Act is prone to being overused in that regard. And the British Home Office at this very moment is weighing the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States, where he would stand trial for a violation of the Espionage Act, which is here in America, our own version of that overzealous application of national security laws being used against publishers, journalists, and whistleblowers. And RSF considers the use of this law, very antiquated law, against a publisher who is essentially on trial for leaking war crimes that were committed on the battlefield. We consider this to be a gross misuse of the law. And we have called on reform of both the UK Official Secrets Act and the Espionage Act here in the US, which, by the way, hasn't been updated since 1917. It contains very arcane language. It's very difficult to understand. I've talked candidly with Senate staffers who are, the foremost policy experts on these things, and they themselves struggle to understand the law itself because it's written in such an arcane way. And we need laws that reflect today's media landscape, today's right to information, which is widely shared as a democratic value. And, RSF is advocating for that.
But do you think that is there ever a legitimate reason, particularly you say like in conflict, and you mentioned Tigray, we were talking about the invasion in Ukraine, is there ever a legitimate reason for a government to say to the media, don't report on this, it could put troops in danger, or it could put information out that would be useful for an adversary? Should governments ever be taking that stance and telling media what they can and can't report?
It's a fair question. And truth be told, it's always going to be a delicate balancing act in that respect. And I think any journalist who's acting responsibly always has to weigh those kinds of ethical questions. And the test at the end of the day is the public interest. Does the public's right to this information outweigh any possible, real world repercussions or, threats to lives, like you said in your example, troops on the ground or troop movements? The problem is, we tend to see, like I said, overzealous application by governments. We don't see a very lenient approach when we're talking about national security, and governments tend to err on the side of being, should we say, overly cautious on these things. And so RSF is, only going to be getting involved when we see this misapplication of national security laws.
And do you think there's also, just sort of thinking about the foreign agent laws, we do have this sort of problem with disinformation and a sort of Russian or Chinese state media, for instance, that finding wide markets and platforms to be able to spread disinformation about key issues, particularly through either networks or on their social media. One of the questions that often comes up is so Russia, Nicaragua, they demand that people label that this is produced by a foreign agent. And in the US, a few years ago, the government required Russian state media to do the same, to be labeled, but to register under the foreign agents. And that kind of labeling, even with the sort of the spectrum of state media and media funded by and is independent of a government, do you think that sort of opened up to abuse or mislabeling?
The open use, we see it all the time, particularly, when we're talking, there's this asymmetry that exists between, on the one hand, you have this open media ecosystem in Western democracies, and then you have the closed information media system of a repressive regime like China. And what that allows is for Chinese state media and propaganda, for example, to permeate the rest of the world in a way that media from the open media landscape can't in reverse. And what the democracies of the world need to do is coordinate on global policy to combat this and set up more of a paradigm that allows for an even exchange of media. There are many details we can get into there, but to make a long story short, RSF helped found the Forum on Information and Democracy, which is an attempt to create just that, a community of democracies that can band together and create a global policy that fixes this asymmetry in information.
Oh, that's fascinating. Sort of picking up on that theme of sort of solidarity and sort of community solutions. Cindy, I know we were talking earlier about, so you're in Costa Rica with several other Nicaraguan journalists, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how exiled media work to keep their audiences at home or others who are also in exile informed of what's going on, and how you work with the Costa Rican media and citizens to sort of help sort of share information and ideas.
Well, the internet, social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, they have played a crucial role, as those are the spaces that allow us to publish our content and distribute it as well. We used to have two very successful TV shows at Confidencial, Esta Semana and Esta Noche, before 2018, but we are censored from the national TV by the government. Then in 2021, we started a radio show in one of the few independent radio stations in the country in order to reach a bigger audience. But we were forced to stop doing that since the government falsely accused our director for alleged money laundering and other false accusations, and that caused the radio station to be afraid of being closed. So now we only publish our audio content on Spotify. So online platforms are crucial to us, and this is the case of the majority of reporters who are in exile. They have kept doing their jobs, and despite the difficult circumstances, they have even started their own media outlets, their own platforms. And as for the way that we gather and process our information, some journalists are still in the ground working under very stressful situations and keeping a very low profile, while the ones outside of the country, like myself, I'm based in Costa Rica, the US and Spain also, we have other colleagues reporting and doing their work from there. And so we are the ones who can have a more visible profile to deliver the news to our audience. So it's a work team. And obviously having trustworthy sources both inside and outside of the government in Nicaragua is also key to understand what is happening in the country, what is relevant, how things are evolving. And also we have found a lot of solidarity from reporters in Costa Rica, in Spain, in the US. Most of our colleagues, when they started from exile, they didn't have anything. So we found a lot of solidarity from our audiences as well, who provided and chipped in for us to buy, I don't know, cameras or phones, any tripods, anything that we needed to keep reporting. So that also has been very important. Also having other channels available for us to spread our information. For example, in Costa Rica, the biggest TV station, Teletica, they have been very, very nice because they have provided us with a space where we can inform the Costa Rican audience and the Nicaraguans living in Costa Rica about what happens in Nicaragua, because every country has different dynamics and like their own realities and problems. And in this case, we find it particularly useful to raise awareness about the crisis that is happening in Nicaragua. And we have also found the same response from other colleagues from Central America and Latin America.
That's great. That sounds like a really good sort of like community, a good example of community coming together and being able to open up to new audience as well, which is so important. We've got a similar situation, I guess, Danila, happening in Russia, where a lot of, like we've seen these sort of iconic outlets closing, and with the ability of independent news outlets to operate being limited. What's happening with Russian media, these great sort of independent outlets, is it just over for them, or are you seeing efforts by them to sort of regroup and keep reporting outside of Russia?
Exactly as you said, there are several examples of how journalists whose media outlets were closed or who closed themselves in order not to help state spread disinformation, they organize their work in new forms. For example, the journalists for the Doors TV channel, which I already mentioned, they broadcast on YouTube, and some journalists and presenters of radio station Echo of Moscow do the same. Echo of Moscow were closed down by Russian authorities in the very beginning of so-called special military operation, which is actually a war. So the experience of reorganizing into new media from the closed was one of the first applied even in 2014. I remember that at that time, very popular internet media, Lenta.ru, were closed down, or rather taken over by pro-state owner. So the journalists from Lenta.ru, they decided to found independent new media called Medusa, which is now very popular. And Medusa is now one of the leading internet media in Russian language. So, and of course, now we have a different situation from 2014 because Russia is now waging full-scale aggressive war. I mean, a Russian army is officially in Ukraine, and all gloves are off. And now media are not just being taken over or closed; the employees being prosecuted on criminal charges, and journalistic work threatens people with a prison term of up to 10 years. I mean, just to call war the war, you can have time in jail. But at the same time, Russian independent journalism is regrouping, as you said, and doing its job. I mean, it shows very well by last interview of Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky to 4 or 5 Russian independent media, which was the wonderful channel for Ukrainian authorities to reach Russian audience, to deliver some truth to them, and also I mean, the example of Voice of America and Radio Liberty is wonderful. At the same time, when we were banned in Russia physically, our audience is expanding because people are learning how to use VPN, and people learning how to say overcome all these obstacles from the state. So at the same time, when these obstacles are coming to independent journalism, this journalism is trying to find new ways. And I know the several initiatives in the West, including in the United States, to promote Russian independent journalism. For example, I know that some kind of New Yorker style magazine is now in a stage of preparation, which would be just a Russian version of this New Yorker magazine. I mean, the cultural life of Russian mind, of Russian ideas abroad from Russia is now finding ways to be published in Russian and in English. So, of course, under pressure, journalism is developing new ways to deliver.
And is there a disconnect happening yet? Like you mentioned, like these, they just seem sort of obscure to a Western audience, ways that the Russian media are being instructed on how to report or not report about the war, that it has to be this special operation, that the Russians are that the Russians are trying to justify the invasion. But is there a disconnect now that Russian casualty figures coming back, that Russian troops have not been greeted with parades and being welcomed by Ukrainians who are, according to Putin, just waiting to be rescued? As families are seeing that there's sort of military losses coming back, is the audience in Russia starting to question the official line of the war?
This is not exactly how it works in Russia. Sometimes it works the opposite. I mean, Russian society is now really ill with this propaganda, infused propaganda injected imperialism. And we can see from the interviews of even Russian mothers who lost their sons in Ukraine that, okay, now we shall go to the end. Now we have to revenge the death of my son and so on. And while some people cannot find the truth about their loved ones, their kids actually who lost their life in Ukraine, it's not a public mood to change the view on this military operation because of that, because propaganda did such an evil job to to inject the society with the mix of hatred to Ukrainians, imperialistic thoughts, and belief that picture is more or less consistent, that Ukrainians are Nazis, and we do some job with denazification and demilitarization and so on. So, and this all works, unfortunately, in the hands of Russian government. That's why they are so brutally cutting all independent sources of information. So I mean, even if some sources are available for Russians, they not necessarily listen to them. I would recommend to read, probably with Google Translate or something, latest piece on Medusa, this independent internet outlet, which been published about the psychological situation in Russia, and it explains very well why Russians are not upset generally, even with this loss of life of their kids in Ukraine.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Danila. I really appreciate you responding to that question. I was interestingly, as you said, you pointed out like VOA saw this sort of audience surge, and Russians generally have seemed to adapt well to using VPNs and other measures to be able to circumvent the censorship. Clayton, I know that RSF has been sort of offering sort of very practical support, and not just in Russia and Ukraine, but you tend to sort of offer practical solutions to journalists who are finding their websites blocked or who need to go into safe houses. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the work that RSF does in those fields to sort of keep news outlets running, to keep journalists able to keep reporting when they're under threat.
Sure. You know, as a free press watchdog, we do the naming and shaming that is expected of a group in our position, and that's a vital part of our work. But we're also very focused on being proactive and looking for solutions that are going to impact the situation on the ground. And so Danila was talking about Medusa's great independent journalism in Russia. RSF was able to set up a mirror site to help them circumvent Russian blocking so that more people can continue reading that vital journalism. You know, we also have been working pretty closely with Russian journalists who are fleeing Russia and helping them set up operations in exile so that they can continue doing their job and providing the journalism that the Russian-speaking readership needs to have access to. You know, and I can't get into too many details about what we do for individual journalists, but you know, generally speaking, we are also very active in helping journalists who are being harassed by states find relocation or exfiltration. We have fairly good relationships with several governments that we've been able to work with on this. We're very proud to work with the French government late last year on an evacuation flight of 50 journalists from Afghanistan, for example, during the peak of that evacuation. And on the ground in Ukraine, we set up a press freedom center, which is a hub for all of our activity there, and is a place that any journalist covering the conflict can go and get all kinds of support, from bulletproof vests and helmets to cybersecurity and physical security training to psychological support services, or really even if they just need a quiet place to charge their phone and file their story. Because we immediately saw there was going to be a need on the ground for journalists covering this conflict, the first of its kind on European soil in quite some time.
Yeah, I was very interested when we heard about that. It just seems, particularly in Ukraine, where there's just been like this, as with any sort of conflict zone, that big influx of people rushing in to report and tell the story. And we saw some, obviously there've been several deaths of journalists who are out on assignment in Ukraine and others injured. So I imagine that practical support is just very timely at the moment, and a good example of the practical support that journalists need on the ground in the moment. I would just wanted to sort of go back to the digital thing, though. Another of the sort of big issues in press freedom in the last sort of 12 months has been the sort of digital surveillance of journalists. And you mentioned earlier about Costa Rica being one of the first countries, I believe, to come out and actually make a stand about not using government-approved spyware. I just wanted to know a little bit more about that and how important it is for countries with a better press freedom record, Costa Rica, the US even, to push back against surveillance and efforts to sort of interfere with the news gathering process.
Yeah, and the backlash against that sort of spyware is really building up globally. And you've seen the Biden administration, for example, take steps against Pegasus, which is the Israeli-developed spyware tool of choice these days of repressive regimes the world over. We know, for example, that particular tool was used to hack into Jamal Khashoggi's fiance's phone and may have been pivotal in his eventual assassination in Istanbul. So we see these tools that are sold as national security tools to target terrorists and organized crime, but in the hands of repressive governments, they're used against human rights activists and journalists. It seems like every other week we are hearing of a new instance of a journalist whose phone has been hacked. And these aren't people who are under surveillance because they're conducting criminal activity. They're just investigating the government. They're just doing their jobs. And so I think it's really important to shine a light on what is going on in these countries, what is going on with these private companies that are developing these spy tools in a way that we haven't really had to deal with before. And I think it's imperative that not just journalists, but news readers are equipped with the tools themselves to keep themselves safe online, to maintain their privacy. The use of VPN is so important. The Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta, I know, was teaching its readers to use VPNs before they were even shut down. And now we're seeing a number of governments even going after the use of VPN, making that illegal. It's outright illegal in several countries. A lot of other countries are starting to clamp down on its use. So it's, in a way, it's a game of whack-a-mole. The tech community will come up with ways to circumvent the rules that authoritarian regimes impose, and then those same regimes will find new ways to block them. So it's a question of being ever vigilant as both a journalist and a consumer of the news.
Yeah, definitely. And it just feels like I'm always impressed by the sort of resilience and the solution sort of aspect that journalists seem to have pivoted to more. Like you say, a new technology comes up, is quickly censored, and then the government finds a way to criminalize using VPN or another method just to be able to access news. But I find that sort of solidarity within the journalist community always strikes me as one of the things that is just so important about press freedom, about keeping news flowing and making sure that our audiences are informed, because that's what it comes down to, I think, at the end of the day. But I guess on that note, with everything that we've discussed today, I really wanted to get a sense from all of you about what you think is so important for independent media and how we can do more to support those who are under attack or repression. I will go to Cindy first, if that's okay. So what do you think is the most important aspect of independent media in today's society?
Well, in the case of Nicaragua, where there is a state police, where people can't exercise their civil liberties, where people are afraid of ending up in prison or suffering from economic retaliations from the government or police harassment, I think that the press and journalism is seen as one of the remaining strongholds of democracy. And I think that there are many ways in which you can all support us and have supported us throughout these 4 incredibly hard years. We definitely need to have safety, both physical and digital security, like you were talking. We don't want to lose more lives in the middle of this crisis. That's why many of my colleagues have taken the decision of leaving the country, which is not an easy one, to protect their lives. So any kind of training, as Clayton was mentioning, sharing information, safety tips from reporters around the world is useful. We have also trained and gained more knowledge about how to better protect ourselves and our platforms online. But I think that the decision makers within Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, they should be informed about particular situations like the one in Nicaragua, where we see attempts from the government to silence and harass the media, and also to create distrust among the audiences by creating troll farms, which share tons of fake news and smear campaigns. We recently saw how Facebook took measures and dismantled these farms in Nicaragua. They were paid by the Nicaraguan government. And we need more of that kind of proactive measure from them to protect journalists and journalism. To the international media, I would say, please don't stop reporting on what's happening in Nicaragua. It's the worst human rights crisis the country has faced in the recent history, and we need people to know out there that this is happening. I know that a lot is happening everywhere, but the international community needs to know that they can do something about it, that this is very serious, and that this is the consolidation of the third dictatorship in the Americas, and that these can lead to further regional destabilization. And to the audiences, to the entities interested in supporting freedom of the press and high quality journalism, we need help to keep doing this. We need to not only maintain our production levels, but we have to be better, to expand, to learn more, to create better content, and to do deeper coverages. And that is not cheap. We have been able to grow at Confidencial despite the situation, but we need to keep growing to deliver the content our audiences need. So I would ask to keep reading what we do, keep watching our videos, and support us through our different fundraising efforts. In Confidencial, our website does not have a paywall. All the content is available, but we also have a membership program in case you want to collaborate with the journalism that we are doing.
Thank you for that. I love the idea of journalism being like a stronghold of democracy. Danila, I'll go to you next. It seems like obviously free-flowing news in Russia is more important than ever, particularly with the disinformation campaigns there. What can be done to help support Russian media at this moment?
I absolutely agree with Cindy. So it's solidarity and support to Russian journalists from all other media, from what has been mentioned already, supporting them by all means, and more resources for independent journalism, including sometimes state resources from democratic countries. Of course, we need new distribution channels like social media, but not only. I know, for example, that some public initiative to broadcast VOA program Flashpoint Ukraine to the some territories of Russia, and I don't know if we can come back to radio days, but radio seems to be free and still flowing information channel for many. Also, we need to, as I said, revive and renew the existing media very much to be more like media in the war times. I mean, we have a great experience of the BBC and the Voice of America in the time of World War II. It's of course very upsetting to make these comparisons, but it is a comparison which is legitimate now. And should be greater work with citizen journalists. I mean, with so-called civic journalism, and at the same time, civic journalism need to know the standards of real professional journalism. So the exchange should be constant. Again, as I already mentioned, use the social media, and we need not only to inform, but to expose propaganda, to debunk disinformation, and there will be the whole new area of the use of journalism, that we actually fight against propaganda which supports war, which supports the killing of people. So this is also part of journalism, to expose propaganda and debunk disinformation. And of course, it should be much more investigative journalism, because the main threat for Putin's regime was investigations of Alexei Navalny about the wealth of his inner cycle in Russia and so on. It is journalism. It is investigative journalism. So we need more of that to give people at least an opportunity to have second thoughts about that. If authorities are lying to you about their incomes, maybe they are lying to you about this war as well. So this thing: solidarity, investigative journalism, resources.
Yeah, always the resources. And I think that's very important and timely at the moment as well, about the role that journalists play more and more in trying to, we find ourselves more having to more clearly fact check and show readers and debunk disinformation. And that's becoming just sort of like a standard part of newsrooms now. I mean, here at VOA, we have Polygraph, which does these great deep dives on debunking a lot of the false information that's circulating in the world. And I think personally we need more of that kind of sort of media approach to be able to help readers understand what's happening. But Clayton, I mean, you feel like you have the weight of the world's media on your shoulders at RSF with so much happening. And you've talked a little bit about the advocacy approaches and the naming and shaming and some of the practical measures you do, but why do you all keep doing it? Why is it so important in the world to keep protecting and keep defending independent media?
The free access to information is the cornerstone of a free society. It's as simple as that. If journalists like Cindy and Daniela weren't doing what they were doing, we would be living in a much worse world. It's easy to take for granted living in a country with a relatively good record on press freedom, even if it can be improved. But if we're not all diligent, we can lose our rights very quickly. Authoritarians are counting on our complacency. So, my message to everyone is keep reading, keep watching, and demand more of your leaders at all times.
Nice words. I just want to say, I guess we're coming up close to the end of our time, but I'm hoping that if any of our audience here, while we have these great panelists here, if you have any questions or issues that we haven't covered, if there's any questions that anyone would ask, you can put them into the chat function, and our team here will get to them. I guess sort of while we're waiting for that, Clayton, you mentioned sort of Afghanistan, and I feel like that was like the really big sort of global story before Russia took over. I wonder if you could sort of give any updates about what's happening with the Afghan media there. I know that sort of the ones who have stayed are finding that they're having to navigate this very tricky landscape with Taliban censorship directives, and others who are in the exile process are now trying to resettle into their home countries. Are you all still working with foreign governments to try to find ways to get these journalists safe, not only safe, but able to sort of get up and working again so that their audiences still have some kind of independent news coming?
Sure. It's a huge challenge. The Taliban has been incrementally cracking down on the remaining independent media that are there. Even after the mass exodus late last year, a number of journalists stay behind, and not to mention, native Afghan journalists who are still there. But more and more, we're seeing censorship. We're seeing the closure of organizations, and we're certainly seeing women journalists being targeted, being harassed, and being chased out of the profession altogether, possibly never to return. And it's a huge concern for us.
And I guess on that theme, I was just going to ask Cindy, do the Nicaraguan journalists who are in exile, do you see an end in sight? Do you see a moment that you might be able to go back in the near future, or you're just sort of settling at the moment that with Ortega, it just feels like you've got to stay put at the moment for very clear sort of safety reasons?
Yeah, it's a very hard question, because I think that all of my colleagues in Confidencial and other media outlets, they want to go back right now, but we have like no guarantees at all, like no physical safety. I don't know, it's too risky. I know that a lot of our reporters were trying to go back in November for the election, and they were going to go as a way of like claiming their right to exercise journalism from their origin countries. But what they found out is that the government was also preventing Nicaraguan citizens from coming to from entering their own country. So that's the situation, and I don't think that journalists can go back unless we have some rights restored, some like the civil liberties, the commitment of the government to respect the constitutional rights. If we ever find a situation where the human rights organizations like the UN or the OAS, when they can enter the country to fulfill their duties, to see what's going on inside the country, I think that would be at least one minimum guarantee of our protection. In the meantime, I don't think it's possible for the people who have fled to come back, because it's just too risky. You can end up in jail.
It's got to be such a tough time to sort of that not knowing when it's safe or you're able to return home. Okay, I think we have one question that I'll put. We've touched on this a little bit already, but we have a question from one of our viewers which asks the panelists what the take is on VOA's previous director, Amanda Bennett, who is the current nominee to be the head of the US Agency for Global Media, if her confirmation is confirmed. In 2017, she was questioned on whether Putin's propaganda news outlet RT should be required to register in the US as a foreign agent. Now, Clayton, we talked a little bit about this earlier. I just wonder if anyone else has anything about that sort of labeling, by labeling a sort of state-backed, completely state-run media outlet as a foreign agent. Danila, maybe has that sort of tit-for-tat labeling?
Yeah, I think it was some thoughts about possible retaliation towards the Voice of America and RFRL, and there is also a very, very, very difficult balance between the right thoughts about is this media or this is propaganda already, and probably the harm which this propaganda brings is more than any question of freedom of speech. And at the same time, as I understood, at that time there was a really big concern about possibility to have Voice of America, Current Time, and RFRL be labeled as a foreign agents, which means in Russian situation, foreign agent means spy. So that was the reason why I had to leave Russia, because it was 2017 when VOA been labeled as a foreign agent. So I think there were concerns, and this, in the end, we see that our all this media, I mean, American USAGM media, were labeled as foreign agents. So I think the leadership of Voice of America at that time had to think about it very carefully.
And I think as well, there's a big distinction as well between state-funded and state-controlled, and a lot of that is to do with editorial independence.
Definitely,
so,
yes.
The way we receive funding from government, but we have these very strict editorial firewalls that prevents any interference, either from our senior management or from outside political forces trying to tell us what to do. And I think that's what really globally sets independent journalists apart, is that you don't answer to anyone, or really the only people you answer to are your audiences, in terms of giving them the information that they need and helping them make sense of the world. So it becomes very tricky when authoritarian governments try to do that, claim that sort of like for like. If we try and stop propaganda, they will try to discredit legitimate media. I do think as well, with that sort of tit for tat that we saw a little bit with China in recent years, and I don't know, Clayton, if you were particularly sort of in that area, but it felt like there was like this visa tit for tat. There were caps on Chinese journalists working in the US, and then China started to expel foreign correspondents in Beijing. And at the end of the day, what's I feel is lost is that audiences lose that ability to fully understand and have a journalist in place, in location, covering the news, but do you think those sort of tit-for-tat wars with Western governments and authoritarian regimes almost damages sort of media relations?
It definitely can. I mean, the governments themselves just have to ask the question, you know, what are they really getting out of it by expelling a state-backed journalist from a repressive regime? I think you really hit the nail on the head. Is like, we need to make this important distinction between state-funded and state-controlled, because public funding is in fact an essential part of a robust, independent, free press. You know, the countries that do the best on RSF's index on press freedom tend to be the countries that have a lot of public funding available for media. That's not to say that the government is dictating an editorial line. It's not to say that these media organizations are arms of the government. But, you know, journalism, authentic journalism, is a public good, and we should treat it that way.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I think we're nearly out of time, and obviously you guys all have so much to do, and I'm just so grateful that you could join us today and help our audiences understand a little bit, sort of globally, but also in Russia and Nicaragua, about the challenges for journalists in what has been a very challenging year all around. Thank you so much for your time today, and I guess that's it. Thank you also to our audience for joining us and for being interested in the importance of press freedom.
Thank you very much.